Welcome back. Governor Rick Perry made a road trip to Iowa this week, further suggesting he might run for president again. Iowa, of course, is a major stop for presidential hopefuls because it is the first caucus in the nation. Perry could face an uphill battle in his home state, though. In the UT Texas Tribune poll, Perry only gets about 10% support among Republicans in the presidential race. Compare that to Texas Junior Senator Ted Cruz with 28%. Rand Paul, Paul Ryan, and Jeb Bush rounded out the top 5 potential candidates. This week I spoke with Jim Henson from the Texas Politics Project, the group that worked with our media partner, the Texas Tribune, to release this morning's polls. Here's his inside take on what those numbers really mean for the statewide candidates ahead of this week's primary. With the race for governor, the poll that you had in October had a much smaller gap between Wendy Davis and Greg Abbott. Now he's in the double digits. What does that say for Democrats?
Well, I think when we were in the field in October and we found Abbott leading Davis by 6, timing was really essential at this point. There were still not a lot of people paying attention to this as an election race, and Wendy Davis was coming off of a very strong summer in which her star had risen. Democrats were enthusiastic. Her name recognition had really increased. I think, between October and February, what you saw is a little bit of an evening out of people's views of this, and we saw a little bit of a return to what we would expect to be the normal pattern. So I think most interesting here is that if you look at the approval numbers of both candidates, Greg Abbott's positive favorability number increased by 9 points in that window, and his name recognition went up. Wendy Davis's favorability number stayed basically the same, and her negatives went up about 4 points. So that gave us a sense of what the candidates were doing in the interim that kind of pushed us back into this normal realm. Wendy Davis initially was spending a lot of time raising money, traveling out of state, putting a campaign team together, and then had a couple of weeks of pretty bad media. On the other hand, the Abbott campaign spent their time getting out there, running positive ads, driving Abbott's name recognition up, and in a sense, kind of a mixture of introducing himself to people that hadn't really thought about him very much and reintroducing himself to Republicans who knew who he was but for whom he wasn't very fixed. So I think that kind of shows us what was going on in the interim and where these numbers come from.
When it comes to name recognition with Republicans, this poll was done after or before the whole Ted Nugent factor, correct?
Right. So we have been in a flow with lots of events. I think in terms of media coverage, Davis really was still absorbing the negative news cycles that she had experienced right before we went in the field with this poll. But we were out of the field before the Ted Nugent sort of matter broke and became something for the Abbott campaign to cope with. To be honest with you, I think in the long run, both the early bio stories about Wendy Davis and the Ted Nugent factor for Abbott will probably recede in voters' consciousness by the time we get to the fall campaign.
With the race for lieutenant governor, it looks like there's going to be a runoff, by your numbers, probably between Dewhurst and Patrick. Judging from the way the last couple of sessions have gone in the Senate, it seems like that would be a very contentious runoff.
Yeah, the lieutenant governor and Senator Patrick have something of a torturous personal and political history. In a lot of ways, I think, as this campaign took shape during the fall, it was looking more and more like this is where we were headed, a Patrick Dewhurst runoff. I think the lieutenant governor is ahead of the senator by several points. There could still be some movement here, but almost certainly we'll see a runoff. And it will very much play out as an establishment candidate in the personage of the lieutenant governor versus somebody who has been seen as a champion of the grassroots and the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And somebody, frankly, that insiders in the process and a lot of elements of the business community have been pretty direct about saying they were reluctant to see become lieutenant governor. So it will see a race, should it turn out to be Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst and Senator Patrick, we'll see a race that really brings into sharp relief several of the fundamental cleavages in the Republican Party over the last year.
But again, this poll was conducted before the questions about Senator Patrick possibly having undocumented workers back in the 80s, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think the undocumented worker issue, if you want to call it that, from when Senator Patrick ran his bars, I guess they were, came up, after we were in the field. Again, how that issue plays, I think, remains to be seen. It's unclear to me that that's had a major impact on Senator Patrick, but we'll see.
Attorney General is another one that you and your poll believe would possibly have another runoff. It seems like this hasn't been a race that's gotten as much talk as some of the other ones.
Well, there are a lot of races that are pretty contentious, and once you get below the top of the ballot, it's hard to grab voters' attention. So in the Attorney General's race, we've seen kind of a similar dynamic between a relatively center-right candidate and a candidate that it's well liked among the grassroots. Even though the overall dynamic has been for everybody to try to illustrate their conservative credentials. That race, too, looking like we'll probably have a runoff. That could be a little bit of a closer call. You've got one candidate over 40% in that race.
With two possible runoffs statewide, what is that going to do ahead of that runoff, as far as media buys and, the campaigns really having to continue grabbing attention from possible voters? Well,
it'll mean another spate of fundraising. It means voters will see, more campaign ads, which, is going to make nobody happy. Certainly not the people that have to buy them, and certainly not the people that have to watch them. Not bad for the stations. But overall, I mean, what you'll wind up seeing is the candidates having to immediately pivot and in some cases raise more money. Although in the lieutenant governor's race, it appears that we've seen the lieutenant governor's campaign strategically planning for a runoff and holding back on some of those ad buys.
With a runoff in the lieutenant governor GOP primary, how does that help a candidate like Leticia Van de Putte?
Well, theoretically, what it does is it induces more division and gives you more fodder in terms of the negative campaigning that could happen during a runoff. It also forces those campaigns to spend more money that they ideally would rather spend in a general election. That said, most Republican candidates are going to go into this with a substantial advantage over any Democratic candidate in the fall when it comes to money. From a Democratic perspective, theoretically, every little bit helps, but it takes a lot of little bit to really overcome the native advantage that Republicans have right now in the general election climate.
With this being the first real statewide poll, what do you think Wendy Davis's campaign is thinking right now, seeing these results?
Oh, it's hard to say what they're saying inside. I think from the perspective of the Davis campaign, there's not a lot of good news here, but I don't imagine there's any big surprises either. You can look at this as half full, half empty. The half empty perspective is that they do seem to have lost some of the momentum that they had at the end of the summer going into the first part of this campaign. On the other hand, if they are behind in the neighborhood of 11 points, they haven't lost ground. The last Democratic candidate lost by 12.5. The Davis campaign seems to be able to raise more money, seems to have at least the potential to mount a campaign. I mean, there's no real good news here, but there's no signs of collapse either. They're in the middle of a kind of gray area in terms of her favorable, unfavorable numbers, in terms of how they're running against Abbott. They still have a big hill to climb. The bottom hasn't dropped out, but they haven't seen the change in the fundamentals that they really need to make headway here.
Yeah, looking back to 2010 when you had the Democrat Bill White who was running against Governor Perry for the governorship, how does his numbers compare to what we're seeing now with Wendy Davis?
I'd have to go back and look, Josh, but my sense is that at this point, White was down by about 9, so it's comparable.
And how did it turn out for him?
It didn't turn out very well for Bill White, but I think that there is a sense in which there are other resources being brought to bear in the Davis campaign at this point. But again, there's no reversal of a basic trend here, and Democrats still don't seem to have kind of cracked the code, if you will, in terms of breaking out of the trend line.
Beyond the election, Henson's group also asked voters their thoughts on marijuana use in the state, plus several other hot-button issues. You can see the rest of those poll results by going to the political story up now on the homepage at KXAN.com. Coming up, our political roundtable breaks down the race for lieutenant governor and the primary just a few days away. Morgan Smith from our media partner, the Texas Tribune, and Ben Philpott from KUT's Agenda Texas, when State of Texas In Depth returns.